Last time we left off by noting the people of the southern part of Britain may have had a common language by the end of the 9th century. Now we shall prepare the ground to be covered in coming centuries on land ownership and law.
Bede begins his history with the phrase Britain, formerly known as Albion, and in his opening paragraph speaks of the English, which sounds like an ethnic description. He is writing almost 3 centuries after the arrival of Hengist and Horsa, so we might speculate that the incomers, Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, were already seen collectively as English by educated men. By Bede's time, they may even have seen themselves as English. But the name England comes much later in writing, according to George Beach of Western Michigan University, Kalamazoo. Professor Beach finds the Latin word Anglia, meaning England, in the writings of the historian Ethelweard of Wessex in the late 10th century, quoting this sentence: "Britannia is now called Anglia, taking the name of the victors, who had become the Angli." Ethelwerd's use of the adverb now in "is now called" suggests that the kingdom had been called Anglia or England by people only pretty recently. There are other occasional references of this sort. The later Saxon kings, descendants of King Alfred the Great, never referred to themselves in their charters or on their coins by this territorial title, but via a variety of other titles which we shall meet. The first king to use Ingaland routinely in his charters and letters was Canute, the Danish ruler of England from 1016. In his law code of 1018, he is styled King of all England, possibly not mere pomp, but the assertion of political reality that Viking Danes and English had finally united. The title might also have been an expression of Canute's hope that the races had made peace under his rule. He himself had married the widow of the last Anglo-Saxon ruler, King Ethelred II. This woman, Emma, would see 2 of her sons, Arthur Canute by Canute and Edward the Confessor by Ethelred II, crowned kings of England. It was William the Conqueror's reign that ended any doubt about national nomenclature, and the name England was routinely applied to the whole of Great Britain, even after the 1707 Act of Union with Scotland, and stuck until the Second World War for most people in the Anglo-Saxon world, except the Welsh and the Scots, naturally enough. Indeed, living in England and thinking of themselves as British seems to me to be less felt by the English in the last 10 years than hitherto, perhaps the result of greater Scottish and Welsh self-expression since the devolution of those nations in 1999. One style that has hardly changed is that Elizabeth II, like all her predecessors since William the Conqueror, is routinely spoken of as the Queen of England, though she is in fact the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. There has been no Kingdom of England or Scotland for more than 300 years since the Act of Union, which established the Kingdom of Great Britain. There was one final language in Anglo-Saxon times, the written book language. It had been Latin, but by the 10th century it was also English and would have had crucial implications for land ownership. Bookland was land given by a king to a follower or to a religious foundation and written down. The written grant was known by Bede's time and may have worked as charters did later, a copy being given to the grantee and another kept for the king's records, evidence of ownership and land transfer. Possibly important charters were sent in copy to the leading religious houses in the area of the grant, so that these centres of mostly literate people had a record of the king's acts. Documents are sparse, but important noblemen may have copied this practice. It was the beginning of the hereditary ownership of land in England, and since land was becoming hereditary, wills also became important. Dorothy Whitelock prints the will of Ealdorman Alfred in her English historical documents, in which he leaves Bookland to his wife Wearborough and their son Ethelwold, subject to the consent of King Alfred and his councillors. The bequest was confirmed sometimes between 871 and 888, and here we have an early example of what has long been called, and is still called, probate, state sanction for the transmission of property to an heir. The Church soon became intimately involved in this legal procedure for good reason. Abbeys and cathedrals were ubiquitous. Clergy were literate, and some gradually acquired legal skills for this development in secular affairs. The Church was also very often a beneficiary in a will, a bequest being made by a testator out of religious conviction or in hope of smoothing his or her path in the afterlife. In that age of profound belief in Christianity, it would be a mistake, I think, to attribute such bequests to cynicism as a reinsurance policy only. The few Anglo-Saxon wills that survive are mainly to great estates, and it's only long after our period, in the 14th and 15th centuries, that we have much knowledge of the wills of ordinary folk. Michael Woods, in his revealing BBC documentary of a Leicestershire village shown in 2010, finds examples of some bequests of twopence or threepence to the parish church in the late Middle Ages. There's no reason to suppose that the better-off Anglo-Saxon peasant did not also make similar small allowances for the work of God. The Church took control of probate in the Anglo-Saxon period, for what may have been largely a free people. This changed radically after the arrival of the Normans in 1066 and the institutionalization of feudalism, as it were, when the English were to a greater or lesser extent not such a free people. Wills were hardly needed any longer for any but the most important people in society, because many folk now held from a superior lord. This tendency is discernible in the last decades of the Old English monarchy in Wessex and Western Mercia, less so in the Danish or Viking areas of East Anglia, Lincolnshire, North Midlands and Yorkshire. We shall look at this complex issue when we get to the 11th century. From the arrival of the Normans, legal documents like wills also reverted to the Latin of early Bookland, and English as the language of the law was terminated. There may have been an element of retribution, even a sense of superiority bred of conquest in this move, but more likely the Normans simply did not speak English, and nor did the continental priests with whom King William would soon fill most English bishoprics and large abbeys. Nothing is permanent in human existence, of course, and the private ownership of land grew throughout the Middle Ages. Indeed, in the Domesday entry for Walden, Essex, the modern town of Saffron Walden, there are actually more freemen in 1086 than in 1066. By 1500, the feudal system, in itself an 18th century term that would have had no resonance among the Normans, the feudal system had collapsed. The changed circumstances were reflected in 1535 by King Henry VIII's Statute of Wills, which formalized the heritable transmission of property. The ending of Roman Catholicism as the national religion in King Henry's reign did not end the Church's prerogative probate courts, and the established Church continued to manage probate until 1856, when the state took over by Act of Parliament. Some viewers will scold me for going off the point with this threadbare sketch, but most people watching me won't know much of this important matter, so I must be indulged. Wherever Anglo-Saxons have gone as conquerors or explorers since the 17th century, they have taken with them the idea of the property-owning democracy, for themselves at any rate. The free man with his portion of private land seems hardwired into these descendants of the Anglo-Saxons, and the ownership of land was not confined to the great men of the day and their supporters. If there was ever such a thing as a feudal system, it was already being modified when Domesday was compiled in 1086. Serfdom in England, and hardly at all in Scotland and Ireland, was certainly dead by 1500, in the sense of owing service to a lord of the manor and some historians trace its end to between about 1348 and 1381, the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt. That said, there persisted forms of feudal tenures until their abolition in England on the 1st of January 1926, mostly copyhold, and in Scotland until November 2004. Vestigial feudal rights had become more akin to restrictive covenants that many of us know as freeholders and leaseholders. Subjection to a feudal elite was also increasingly commonplace from the early 10th century in France, Germany and Spain. But serfdom had to be abolished by law in those countries. It did not, as in Britain, simply atrophy over time. Serfdom was not abolished in France until 1789, nor in Germany and Spain until the 19th century. As the Carolingian Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne broke down in the 9th century, great feudatories began to establish virtually independent domains or fiefdoms encompassing whole regions of France, Germany and Italy. Their captains or knights received and carved out mini-fiefdoms of their own. Fortresses sprang up to enforce and to extend their interests. Churches, monasteries and abbeys, lesser noblemen or just men on the make were detached by the successor states from the central authority. The Kingdom of France emerged, but was a pale shadow of what it was to become, or had been under King Pippin and the Emperor Charlemagne. Ephemeral kingdoms appeared and disappeared: Burgundy, Arles, Lotharingia, Italy. Such law as there was became arbitrary, dependent on the goodwill or otherwise of some local potentate in his impregnable stone castle, manned by trained troops, some of whom might be mercenaries. Theoretically, the King of France or the German Emperor remained the feudal overlord, but in practice they were often weaker than one of their vassals, a duke or a count of a royal province. These men filled a void left by the disintegration of imperial authority, which had fundamental implications for the islands at the edge of the world, as we shall see. And as ever, when we speak of imperial authority, we should not mistake it for the kind of authority enjoyed by the ancient emperors of Rome or the much later kings of Europe. The Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne was an agglomeration of conquests, many of them recent. The first emperor of the West since the 5th century wrote law and gave orders in writing. But Charlemagne's and his father Pippin's real power lay in their ability to field an army of the loyal, then to march on a disobedient province and crush its ruler. Word of lessons of that sort spread and were likely to have kept many a warlord in his place. On Charlemagne's death in 814 and the division of the empire among his sons and later his grandsons, it is no surprise that ambitious men rose to fill the vacuum left by the royal families' infighting. A result of the disorder on the continent in the 10th century obliged the conquering kings of Wessex to formulate a foreign policy, the first in English history. The breakdown of imperial rule also led to what is known as the Peace of God movement, an attempt initially by brave churchmen and some lay people to curb the petty power of their feudal oppressors. It would gather great momentum, as we shall report, and impinge on Britain. The fall of Charlemagne's empire would have the greatest consequences for the country we know as Germany. It would remain divided into 300 states, some as small as imperial villages, the plaything of rival German princes, the church, French, Spanish, Austrian and even Swedish kings until the 19th century. German belligerence in the 20th century may, to a degree, be accounted for by this. The country was only united as the German Empire with its own Kaiser in 1871. As noted, the homespun English monarchy of Wessex went from strength to strength in the 10th century as the Carolingian Empire collapsed. We shall leave the reasons for this until we reach the reign of King Alfred the Great and his successors. But to revert to the original purpose of this episode, land held freely by churls or peasants was often burdened with obligations to a king, which a king may have granted to one of his followers or to the church. The holder of such land was free to sell it on, including the burdens, and move away. Law codes existed that sought to define such duties, as these were also defined for higher members of society. The peasant freeholder also had the 100 court, which might have defended him against an unscrupulous or overlord. He even had the king's court. We shall investigate landholding, the courts available, and perhaps most important, the sworn jury in later episodes.
In the next episode, who were the barbarians who lived in the island at the edge of the world?